They called it the photograph that warned the living. In the late summer of 1881, when the sun still clung to the Kansas wheat fields and the world moved slow enough to breathe, a family named Grayson gathered for a portrait. The picture was meant to mark a rare moment of happiness, a new home, a good harvest, and their youngest son, Daniel, turning 10. Their neighbor, Mr. Alder, a traveling photographer with a heavy tripod and the patience of a preacher, set up his equipment beside the barn. Everyone stood still as the silver plate captured the moment, except Daniel. The boy's eyes, wide and unblinking, didn't look at the camera. They looked somewhere beyond it, to a space behind Mr. Alder, his pupils widening with what some later described as quiet terror. When the photograph was developed that evening, something was wrong. Every detail was clear: the barn, the smiles, the light streaking across the wheat. But Daniel's face looked slightly blurred, as though he had moved, except he hadn't. Stranger still, there was a faint outline beside him, something resembling a hand resting gently on his shoulder. The family dismissed it as a flaw from the exposure, but Daniel didn't. He refused to sleep that night, claiming the man from the picture was whispering his name from the hallway. His mother comforted him, telling him it was just a dream. But Daniel didn't dream that night. He listened. And by dawn, the boy whispered something to his sister that chilled her to her bones. He says, "I'll be gone by Sunday." Sunday came, and the Grayson household woke to silence. Daniel's bed was empty, his blanket folded, his shoes missing from the floor. They searched the barn, the well, the nearby stream. Nothing. Only a set of footprints leading into the wheat field and stopping abruptly, as though the boy had simply vanished. When the sheriff arrived, he found something wedged behind the barn door, another photograph, undeveloped, still in its glass plate holder. Mr. Alder swore he hadn't taken a second picture, yet the plate bore the faint trace of exposure. When he processed it in his darkroom, his hands trembled so violently he nearly dropped the chemicals. The image was dark, nearly black, but within it, Daniel could be seen standing alone in the field. His face was clear this time, eyes closed, mouth half open as if mid-sentence. And beside him, clearer than before, stood a figure in black, its hand still resting on his shoulder, only now gripping tighter. By the week's end, storms swept through the region, knocking down the Grayson barn and flooding the nearby creek. The photograph survived, though the faces in it appeared distorted by water damage, all except for Daniel's. His image remained untouched, sharp as the day it was taken. Years later, that same photograph would resurface in an antique shop hundreds of miles away, and those who looked closely claimed that Daniel's eyes, once closed, were open again, staring straight at whoever dared to hold it. Decades passed, and the legend of the Grayson boy faded into whispers, until the photograph resurfaced in 1952, tucked inside a forgotten trunk sold at an estate auction in Wichita. The buyer, a local historian named Margaret Holloway, was cataloging items for a small rural museum exhibit titled Life in the Plains, 1800 to 1900. Inside the trunk, wrapped in a strip of decaying linen, she found the glass plate. It was cold to the touch, impossibly so, and despite the dust and damage, the image was clear. Daniel stood in the wheat field, small and still, with the shadow of that strange figure beside him. Margaret, believing it to be a trick of light, pinned it under a lamp to examine the grain of the photo. That's when she noticed something unsettling. The hand on the boy's shoulder was no longer faint. It had taken on texture, depth, almost a human tone. She wrote in her notes, "Shadow seems to have developed further. Impossible artifacting." That night, she placed the photograph in her office cabinet and went home, but her assistant, who stayed behind to clean up, swore the glass plate clicked inside the drawer, like the sound of a camera shutter. The next morning, Margaret returned to find the cabinet door open and the photograph lying face up on the floor. Now, Daniel's had appeared slightly turned. His closed eyes seemed less closed. Margaret, rational woman though she was, felt something instinctively wrong. That afternoon, she ordered the exhibit postponed. But Margaret couldn't let it go. She dug through archives, searching for the Grayson family, and found only fragments, a birth certificate for Daniel, a census record listing 6 family members, then 5. The father's occupation read farmer, but beside Daniel's name, a faint pencil note. Declared missing, presumed deceased. There was no burial record, no obituary, no newspaper mention of a missing child, as though the event had been erased. One surviving document, however, caught her attention, a ledger from a photographer named Samuel Alder, written in 1881, detailing his sessions. The last entry was dated August 21st. Grayson family, second exposure required. Margaret drove out to the site of the old Grayson farm, now overgrown prairie. Only a rusted barn hinge and a stone foundation remained. Locals warned her the place was cursed. They said cattle avoided grazing there, and that sometimes at dusk, you could hear a boy calling faintly from the wheat. She dismissed it as folklore until she set up her own camera to document the ruins. When she developed her photos later that night, every image came out blank, except one. A faint, distant figure of a boy standing near the horizon. In the next frame, he was gone. After that night, Margaret Holloway began to keep the Grayson photograph locked inside a steel drawer at the museum. She told herself it was for preservation, but deep down she knew it was fear. The image had a strange pull, not just curiosity, but something heavier, like gravity itself. Visitors who had seen it claimed it gave them headaches, and one man even fainted after staring too long. "It feels like he's looking through me," he said before leaving abruptly, refusing to come back. Margaret laughed it off publicly, but privately, she wasn't sleeping. Every night, she dreamt of the same field, golden wheat swaying under a gray sky, and a boy standing motionless in the middle, whispering something she could never quite hear. One night, unable to resist, she returned to the museum after closing hours. She turned on the desk lamp and pulled out the glass plate. For a long while, she stared. Daniel's expression, once neutral, now seemed subtly altered, not overtly, but enough that it unsettled her. His eyes appeared slightly open. There was something reflected in them, faint, curved, metallic. A camera lens? Or perhaps her own lamp. She leaned closer, her breath fogging the glass slightly, and when she wiped it clean, she froze. The reflection of the figure beside him had sharpened, not a man, but a boy, identical to Daniel. The sixth figure had returned, this time standing nearer, his face half-shrouded in shadow. Over the following weeks, Margaret documented every change meticulously. Each new photograph she took of the original seemed to alter slightly, as though Daniel's image was evolving. A flicker of a smile one day, a tilt of the head the next. When she asked her lab technician to verify, he refused, saying, "That plate's not right. You can feel it when you touch it." Margaret's notes became increasingly frantic, written in uneven script. "He's trying to show something." Second figure clearer today, smaller frame, identical posture. Then, the last entry before her writing stopped. Eyes moved again. Weeks later, a janitor found her unconscious at her desk, the lamp still burning and the photograph face up beside her. She survived, but when questioned, all she could mutter was, "There were 2 boys now, but only one shadow." The museum quietly removed the exhibit, claiming humidity damage. Yet rumors spread fast through Wichita. People said the photo was cursed, that anyone who tried to replicate it suffered strange dreams or saw faint figures in their own snapshots. And still, beneath all the superstition, the image of the small boy remained unchanged in one haunting way. His faint, half-open eyes seemed to watch. Always watching. Margaret's collapse only deepened the photograph's legend. The Wichita Historical Society quietly closed its east wing, citing structural repairs, though locals knew better. Inside that darkened room, behind layers of velvet covering and dust, the photograph of Daniel Grayson sat untouched, until a man named Elias Harper appeared. Elias, a historian of forgotten photographers, had been tracking the works of Jonas Kettering, a rural portraitist active in Kansas during the late 1800s. Kettering was known for traveling to remote farms and documenting families who could rarely afford such luxury. Yet many of his photos shared an unsettling pattern. blurred faces, unnatural shadows, and subjects who later met grim fates. Daniel's photo, Elias discovered, was taken by him in the fall of 1881, just weeks before the boy's death. The deeper Elias dug, the stranger it became. Kettering's journals, preserved in brittle pages of fading ink, mentioned Daniel by name. The boy spoke of seeing his end. One entry read, "He wanted the moment captured, so he would not be forgotten." In another, the tone shifted. The child moved during the exposure. Eyes open. Said he saw someone behind him. I saw nothing. Elias, transfixed, began to feel the same pull Margaret once did. He decided to restore the plate himself, convinced the truth lay beneath the dust and chemical stains. But the first night he began work, alone under the red glow of the developing lamp, he swore he heard a faint voice whisper his name from the darkness. "You're too late." The next morning, Elias noticed something impossible. In his fresh restoration, the reflection had shifted again. The sixth figure, once faint, now appeared closer, his hand hovering near Daniel's shoulder. Elias compared every older copy, desperate to disprove what his eyes were telling him. But there it was, unmistakable, the outline of fingers, half transparent, pressing gently against the boy's sleeve. That evening, he cross-referenced census records and found something chilling. Jonas Kettering's assistant, a boy of about Daniel's age, had drowned in a river 2 weeks before the Grayson photograph was taken. His name had been Thomas Vale. The two boys had never met. Yet their images were now inseparable, merged within the same glass plate. Elias began to suspect that Kettering's camera, a rare imported model known for unusually long exposures, might have captured something beyond light and shadow. Perhaps the ghost of Thomas had been burned into the plate alongside Daniel's soul. The notion was absurd, but so was everything else about the photo. That night, as Elias stared at the image again, the lamp flickered, and for a brief instant, he thought he saw 2 sets of eyes glimmer back at him. For weeks, Elias lived by lamplight, refusing to leave his workshop. He kept the restored photograph locked beneath glass, yet he couldn't stop looking at it. Every time he turned away, he swore he heard a faint tap on the wooden frame, like fingernails brushing from the inside. Sleep fled him entirely. The smell of old chemicals, developer fluid, and burning wicks filled his small home until the walls seemed to sweat with it. One evening, in a fevered state, he placed 2 magnifiers side by side to study the image closer. That's when he noticed something he'd somehow missed before. Daniel's pupils weren't aligned. In the original, they stared forward. But in this newly developed plate, one of them had shifted slightly to the left, locking perfectly with the translucent hand of the sixth figure. He stumbled back, heart pounding. For the first time, Elias thought about burning the photograph. But curiosity, that dark hunger every historian shares, anchored him. He needed to know how. He retrieved his notes and traced the photograph's chain of custody. The Grayson farm had been abandoned decades ago, purchased later by a cattle broker who left after claiming the barn breathed. The barn, Elias realized, had once been Kettering's temporary darkroom. His field notes confirmed it. Developed plates in Grayson barn. Light steady. Boy uneasy. It was where the original negative had been born, and perhaps where Daniel's final heartbeat had echoed into the lens. Driven by both dread and awe, Elias decided to visit the ruins of the Grayson property. The house was gone, but the barn still stood, its roof caved in, beams like ribs of a long-dead beast. Inside, the air was heavy with dust and the faint metallic scent of decay. His lantern's glow illuminated faint scratches on the old workbench, initials carved deep into the wood. JK, and beneath them, DG. He exhaled sharply. The initials of Jonas Kettering and Daniel Grayson, etched together. Kneeling closer, he realized they weren't carved with a blade. The wood was burned, as if branded by heat. He turned to leave, but the wind caught the rotted doors and slammed them shut. For a moment, everything went black. When the lantern reignited, Elias froze. Hanging from one of the rafters, where no photograph had been before, was a framed copy of Daniel's portrait, identical to his own restoration, except for one impossible change. This version showed Elias himself standing behind the boy, his eyes wide, his hand frozen mid-reach toward Daniel's shoulder. The realization hit him like a blow. The sixth figure had moved again. And this time, it wasn't reaching for the boy. It was reaching for him. By dawn, Elias never returned to his boarding house in Wichita. The landlord, accustomed to his erratic hours, didn't report him missing until 3 days later. When authorities arrived, they found the home in disarray, notes scattered across the desk, jars of developer chemicals overturned, and the air still reeking of sulfur. His bed was untouched. The photograph, the one of the Grayson family, sat in the center of the room beneath a cracked pane of glass. Its surface looked strange, almost wet, as if someone had breathed across it moments earlier. When they lifted the frame, the back panel fell open, and another photograph slipped out. It wasn't dated. It wasn't part of his collection. It showed a man in a dark coat standing inside the Grayson barn, a lantern at his feet. The image was blurry except for one detail: the man's eyes. They stared directly into the lens, cold and wide, reflecting the flash like animal pupils. Some claimed it was Elias himself. Others thought it resembled Kettering, but neither had been seen again. The sheriff sealed the photo as evidence, though local papers refused to publish it, calling it distasteful. Within weeks, rumors spread that the photograph cursed those who viewed it. A clerk who handled the file went blind in one eye. A constable fell down a stairwell. The photo was quietly placed in county archives and locked away. Yet somehow, years later, it resurfaced at a private auction, its provenance traced back to an unknown donor. The buyer was a collector of macabre Americana named Howard Llewellyn, who specialized in occult photography. He kept the portrait sealed behind glass in his gallery, shown only by request. Visitors described a sense of unease near it, as though the air thickened, bending around the frame. One journalist described a faint outline reflected in the glass, a handprint, pressed from the inside. Howard dismissed it as smudge or moisture until one evening. While locking up, he noticed something else, a face in the reflection that wasn't his. It was young, pale, and eerily familiar, a child's, with one eye turned slightly inward. Daniel Grayson. The next morning, the gallery was found open, lights flickering, with no sign of Howard. The only thing out of place was the photograph, tilted on the wall, its glass shattered clean through. Behind the broken pane, investigators discovered fresh dust prints, 5 small fingertips and 1 large, overlapping them. The sixth figure, it seemed, had reached out once more. After that night, the photograph's trail went cold again. The Grayson barn collapsed in a storm the following spring, and all remaining negatives were reported destroyed. But decades later, in 1978, a Kansas archivist restoring damaged collections discovered a mislabeled plate stored under miscellaneous rural families. When she developed it, her assistant fainted at the sight. For within the faded grain, Daniel Grayson still stared forward, and the hand on his shoulder had moved even closer to his throat. For nearly a century, the photograph's existence lingered only as rumor. The Grayson name faded into dusty county ledgers, and the barn where it all began became a skeleton of wood and rot on the Kansas plains. Locals still avoided the property, muttering about the still eyes that watched from broken planks on moonless nights. Farmers claimed their animals refused to go near the foundation, and on certain fog-heavy mornings, the faint sound of a camera's shutter could be heard, long after the barn had burned to ash. Most dismissed these as campfire stories. But in 1978, when that mislabeled glass plate surfaced, everything changed. Archivist Martha Keel, a quiet woman with a reputation for skepticism, decided to restore it. She wanted to prove that legends were nothing more than overactive imaginations from a fearful past. But the moment the image began to form in the developer bath, the room grew colder. Her assistant, Robert, later swore the chemicals began to bubble though the tray was still. As the shadows darkened into faces, Martha saw something no one could explain. Not 5, not 6, but 7 figures. The 7th was little more than a faint blur at first, half in shadow. But as she lifted the plate to the light, its outline sharpened. A man's silhouette standing behind the family, arm resting on Daniel's shoulder. Only, where the face should have been, there was a hollow void, a smear of absence. The restoration report never mentioned the seventh figure. Martha locked the image away, labeling it damaged emulsion. But according to her personal diary, which surfaced decades later, she began hearing faint tapping at night, rhythmic, like a camera shutter. She wrote of a shadow in her reflection, always standing slightly behind her, visible only when she looked too long. Robert, her assistant, quit soon after. In his resignation note, he described seeing Daniel's face pressed against the darkroom glass, mouth open as if whispering something. When Martha died in 1982, her home was cleared by relatives. The plate was gone. All they found in her basement were dozens of photos she'd taken herself, blurred, off-center images of doorways, windows, and mirrors. In several, a vague childlike shape appeared in the corner. When analyzed, each photo showed the same angle of tilt, as though captured by an unseen hand reaching over her shoulder. Years later, her nephew uploaded some of her personal negatives to an online archive of rural Kansas history. One image, grainy, water-damaged, unremarkable, was flagged by an AI algorithm for facial anomaly. It detected 6 distinct figures. But metadata revealed something far more chilling: the upload time. It was posted at 3:14 a.m., though no one was awake at the time. The system log confirmed the file had been placed by user D. Grayson. When the photo appeared online, it was barely noticed at first, just one of thousands of century-old images uploaded to the public archive. The file name was simple: Grayson_family_1881_finalscan.tiff. For weeks, it sat unviewed, gathering digital dust. Then, one night, a forum dedicated to forgotten photography featured it in a discussion thread titled "The Extra in the Frame." Within hours, users began to notice the strange presence in the background, a faint outline behind the young boy, Daniel. Some assumed it was a double exposure, others, a trick of shadow. But one user enhanced the image, adjusting contrast and tone. The shape took form, too distinct to be random. A hand on Daniel's shoulder, a faint smile on a face that shouldn't exist. By morning, the post had gone viral. People shared cropped versions, circled the anomaly, speculated wildly. A few claimed the figure's face seemed to change each time they viewed it, sometimes blurred, sometimes clear, as if the image itself was watching back. The archive site crashed twice from the sudden traffic surge. What was once a forgotten relic had become an internet obsession. Amateur investigators traced the file's upload data, finding the user account inactive, with no recovery email or login history. The IP address led to an unoccupied farmhouse near Haven, Kansas, the same property where the Grayson barn once stood. As the image spread, so did the unease. Those who studied it reported strange technical glitches, screens freezing, distorted reflections appearing in webcams, phones recording bursts of static when the picture was displayed. One Reddit moderator described a sound like soft breathing through her headphones when she zoomed in on the figure's face. Another user, known only as Archivist197, claimed to have enhanced the image further and found something inside the figure's eyes, reflections, faint but unmistakable. When analyzed, they appeared to show a room with a red light, and in the center, a small desk with what looked like a glass plate camera. Days later, Archivist197 deleted his account without warning. His last comment read simply, "It moved." The story spiraled into mainstream media, labeled the Grayson digital curse. TV anchors laughed it off as internet folklore. But 3 weeks later, when the online archive servers experienced a sudden catastrophic failure, the original file was lost. Backup data showed one final modification before deletion, a timestamp reading 3:14 a.m., the exact same time Martha Keel's upload had been recorded decades earlier. And next to the timestamp, hidden deep in the metadata, was one final text entry: "Look behind you." By the fall of 2021, interest in the Grayson photograph had reached academic circles. Among them was Dr. Eleanor Price, a visual anthropologist specializing in 19th century photographic methods. She was skeptical of curses, but fascinated by the idea that an image could manipulate human perception. "It's not the photo that's haunted, she said in a recorded interview. It's our memory of it. Determined to test her theory, she secured access to the original Grayson property in Haven, Kansas, now an abandoned plot of farmland marked by a single, rotting barn foundation. Using a restored 1880s camera, identical to the one believed to have captured the original portrait, Dr. Price recreated the setting precisely. She even dressed local volunteers in period clothing, replicating the lighting conditions down to the faint haze of early autumn dusk. Her assistant, a graduate student named Oliver Shaw, documented the process, noting each exposure. Everything seemed ordinary, until they reviewed the glass plate negatives later that evening. In the first few plates, the composition was perfect, the volunteers standing stiffly, hands folded, gazing directly into the lens. But on the fifth exposure, Oliver froze. Behind the group, barely visible, was a shape, a shadowy outline standing near the corner beam. Indistinct, yet unmistakably human. Eleanor dismissed it as a trick of light. But when she magnified the image, she saw it clearly. A boy's face, turned slightly toward the camera, his eyes half shut, not with life, but with that waxen stillness of something long departed. The resemblance was undeniable. The boy in the recreation looked exactly like Daniel Grayson, down to the faint scar on his left temple, which no one in the volunteer group had. Oliver, shaken, swore he saw no child anywhere near the barn that day. When they checked the site the next morning, they found small footprints in the dust leading from the spot in the photo to the edge of the property, where the old well had collapsed decades ago. Eleanor tried to rationalize it: lens flare, overexposure, digital contamination from the scanning process. But that night, as she worked on enhancing the negatives, she noticed something else. The reflection in the camera's brass lens cap showed her, but not Oliver. Instead, behind her shoulder stood a faint silhouette, watching. She turned immediately. No one. The lab lights flickered, briefly dimming to a dull, amber glow, the same hue seen in the Grayson image. Oliver refused to return to the site. He emailed her once more before leaving Haven, writing, "He's still there. Don't try again." The message was time-stamped 3:14 a.m., the same cursed minute that had appeared in every data log tied to the photograph's history. Eleanor dismissed it as paranoia. But the next day, when she opened the folder containing the scans, one of the images had changed. The group of volunteers was gone. Only the barn remained, and standing in front of it, alone, was the boy. Eleanor couldn't stop staring at the altered image. Every instinct told her to delete the files and leave Haven behind, but the academic in her, the need to understand, anchored her in place. She decided to record the negatives under controlled conditions, using a stationary camera to document any changes. That night, she set up her equipment inside the barn's remains, placing the negatives on a table illuminated by a dim tungsten bulb. The wooden structure groaned with the Kansas wind, its beams creaking like faint whispers in the dark. At exactly 3:14 a.m., her recording began. The footage ran for 40 minutes uninterrupted. Nothing happened until the final 2 minutes. A subtle movement appeared in the reflection of the glass plate, a shifting shadow that didn't match Eleanor's or the camera's. It moved behind her, just out of focus, like someone pacing in slow, deliberate steps. Then, faintly, a soft tap echoed from the far corner, a sound like a fingernail brushing against wood. She turned instantly, flashlight trembling, but the beam caught nothing except dust particles swirling in the stale air. When she played the footage back, her stomach turned. The camera, which had been fixed on the table, momentarily tilted, as if nudged by an unseen hand. And for less than a second, before stabilizing, it caught a glimpse of the barn door, slightly open. The door had been nailed shut for decades. Eleanor's face drained of color as the frame froze, showing the outline of a boy standing in the open crack, his eyes reflecting the light like two dull coins. The following morning, she reviewed the footage again in daylight, hoping she had simply imagined it. But the timestamp confirmed it, 3:14 and 6 seconds a.m., the same cursed minute connected to every version of the Grayson photo. Desperate for validation, she sent a clip to Oliver, who refused to open it. "Delete it," he told her over the phone, his voice brittle with fear. That time, 3:14, it isn't just coincidence. Every account mentions it. That's when Daniel died. That's when the photo was taken. Eleanor's breath hitched. For a moment, she wondered if she had crossed a line no researcher should. Still, she couldn't stop. She returned to the barn that evening, alone, with a plan to document one final session, a live recording under the same conditions. But when she entered, she found something she hadn't left there before: the negatives from the previous night, perfectly arranged on the floor in a circle. Each image showed a different stage of the boy's face turning toward the camera, his eyes opening wider in every frame. Her hands shook as she lifted the last negative to the light. This one was blank, except for a single smudge in the center. When she adjusted the contrast, her breath froze. The smudge formed letters, crude, uneven, as if scratched from the inside of the glass. 3 words: "Look behind you." Eleanor didn't turn immediately. Every instinct in her body screamed not to. But curiosity, that same poisonous thread that had led her here, made her lift her eyes toward the camera lens. It was still recording, its red light blinking like a pulse. She forced herself to slowly pan her flashlight across the barn's interior. The beam landed on the wooden wall opposite her. For a moment, she saw only dust, the outlines of farm tools long abandoned, and strands of spiderweb trembling in the wind. Then her light caught movement. Not large, but subtle. The faint sway of a small figure standing perfectly still near the corner, where the shadows were deepest. The figure didn't move closer. It didn't even seem to breathe. It was the size of a child, thin, wiry, head slightly tilted to one side. As Eleanor's light flickered over it again, she saw the glint of metal, not from clothing, but from eyes. Reflective, cold, unblinking. Her brain screamed run, but her feet didn't obey. The air in the barn thickened, heavy and electric. The walls seemed to creak louder, closer. Then, from somewhere behind her, she heard the unmistakable sound of a camera shutter snapping, that ancient, mechanical click of a plate camera. Only there was no camera but her own. Her heart pounded as she turned. The modern camera she'd brought lay on the floor, toppled. And yet the sound came again, sharper, closer, click. Then another, click. And with each flash, a faint light pulsed across the walls, like the barn itself was remembering every photograph ever taken inside it. Eleanor stumbled backward, her flashlight beam jerking across the dusty boards. "Daniel?" she whispered, the name escaping her lips before she could think. The figure didn't respond, but its head twitched slightly, as though reacting to hearing itself remembered. The air filled with static. Every sound outside the barn, the wind, the insects, even her own breathing, seemed to vanish. All that remained was the slow creaking of the wooden beams and that rhythmic, ghostly click. When she dared to look again, the figure had moved closer, not with the jerky steps of a living person, but with a kind of flicker, as though it existed only between frames of a film reel. 1 second near the wall, the next directly in front of her. Eleanor fell backward, her hand landing on something soft, a strip of fabric, old and brittle. It was a boy's shirt collar. She realized with horror that she was sitting atop what remained of a shallow grave. The dust wasn't just earth, it was decomposed fabric, bone, and ash. Her mind began to spiral. She fumbled for her camera, raising it like a shield. "I just want to understand," she said, her voice trembling. "Please show me." And for the first time, the figure obeyed. It leaned closer, and in that half-light, Eleanor saw its face, not rotting or monstrous, but heartbreakingly human. A boy, perhaps 10, with eyes too wise for his age. He mouthed something she couldn't hear, and then, for a fraction of a second, the light from her camera illuminated his expression. It wasn't rage. It was sorrow. The boy's lips moved again, slower this time, as though trying to form words that the living could understand. Eleanor strained to hear, but all that reached her was a thin whisper of air, almost like the sound of a page turning. Then she saw it, the faint outline of another figure behind him. Taller, rigid, a man, half hidden in the gloom. Her light trembled as it passed over him, revealing an old hat, a heavy overcoat, and hands that looked too pale, too still. The boy turned his gaze toward the shadowed man and seemed to flinch. A sickening realization dawned on Eleanor. The boy wasn't haunting this place. He was bound here, trapped by the memory of something far more terrible. She felt her throat tighten as she raised the camera again. The lens adjusted itself, blurring and focusing, like it was being guided. Through it, she could see the scene not as it was now, but as it had been. The barn transformed. Fresh hay replaced dust. The air shimmered with warmth and light from a summer long gone. The man's shape became clearer, a farmer, perhaps in his late 30s, holding the boy by the shoulders, positioning him stiffly for a photograph. Look right at the lens. The man's voice echoed faintly. Hold still. The boy obeyed. But there was no smile, only quiet terror in his eyes. Eleanor's heart ached. She understood now. This wasn't just a haunting. It was the moment of death, caught and replayed forever by the camera's gaze. Eleanor tried to pull herself away from the vision, but the image seemed to cling to her mind like smoke. The farmer in the photograph, the boy's father, stepped back, inspecting his work. There was something mechanical about his movements, something rehearsed. As the plate camera clicked, the boy's expression faltered, and his eyes rolled upward slightly, as though the life inside them had been snuffed out by the flash. Eleanor felt her stomach twist. The camera hadn't just captured his likeness. It had taken him. The barn returned to its present state in a shuddering breath. Dust settled around her, and the figure of the boy now stood directly before her again, his face pale, but calm. He raised a small, trembling hand toward her, pointing at the corner of the room. Eleanor followed the gesture and saw, beneath a collapsed beam, a stack of glass negatives, blackened with age. She reached for one, and as the dust cleared, she saw it. The same image she had just witnessed, the boy, the father, the camera. But behind them, faint and half-formed, was another figure no one had noticed before, a shadow that didn't belong to either of them. It was taller, leaner, and its face was obscured. Yet its hand rested on the boy's shoulder, exactly where the father's hand should have been. The longer she stared, the clearer it became. The hand wasn't touching, but gripping. Eleanor took the glass negative carefully, holding it against the faint moonlight bleeding through the cracks of the barn roof. The shadow's hand, that impossible, long-fingered thing, looked more defined now, its outline trembling as though alive. Her breath came out in uneven bursts. "What are you trying to show me?" she whispered to the boy. He tilted his head, and for the first time, a word escaped his lips, brittle, dry, almost cracked apart by time. "Father." Her pulse pounded. She stumbled toward the old wooden desk against the barn wall, where piles of yellowed papers lay scattered and rotting. Among them, she found a faded ledger. Its entries were written in a sharp, meticulous hand, each one a record of crops, harvests, and dates. But some entries were darker. April 3rd, she cried again. Can't silence her. April 5th, the boy saw. April 6th, he won't speak anymore. The entries stopped abruptly, right after April 8th, photograph completed. Eleanor's stomach sank as she connected the pieces. The farmer had documented his crimes in plain sight, hidden behind the ordinary rhythms of rural life. The boy's father hadn't been capturing memories. He'd been preserving his sins. Each photograph was his way of freezing those moments, sealing away the evidence behind an illusion of family life. The barn wasn't just where they worked. It was where they vanished, one by one. The mother, the eldest daughter, then, finally, the boy. Eleanor turned toward the child's ghost, her voice trembling. He killed them, didn't he? The boy didn't nod or speak, but the silence was answer enough. The air thickened. The light from her lantern flickered violently. The temperature dropped, her breath visible in the dark. She knew she wasn't alone. Behind her, a slow creaking echoed, like footsteps dragging through old wood. Eleanor turned, expecting to see nothing. But there, half shrouded in the corner, stood the same tall figure from the photograph. Its head tilted slightly, as if acknowledging her discovery. Its presence wasn't angry. It was expectant. It wanted something. The boy looked between them, his eyes wet with a sadness too deep for words. The shadow moved closer, its outline rippling as though it wasn't bound by the rules of this world. Eleanor stumbled back, clutching the negative like a relic. "You can't have me," she said, her voice shaking. But the figure didn't move closer. Instead, it turned toward the old ledger. One long, skeletal finger pointed down at it, and then at her camera bag. It wanted her to document it, to expose what had been hidden. The realization hit her like a flood. This was not a haunting seeking vengeance. It was one seeking witness. The boy and his father's spirit were bound to the photograph because no one had ever seen the truth. And now, Eleanor was the first to see it in over a century. The question was, could she leave the barn and still be herself? Eleanor stumbled backward, clutching the fragile glass negative to her chest as if it were her only shield. Her flashlight trembled in her hand, its flickering beam slicing across the warped wooden beams of the barn. She could still see the boy, his outline faint now, fading into the pale, cold air, and that tall figure behind him, dissolving into the shadows like smoke retreating into darkness. The silence was suffocating. It was the kind of quiet that made you feel like sound itself had died. Her instincts screamed at her to run. She grabbed her satchel, stuffed the ledger inside, and pushed the barn doors open. The night hit her like a wall, heavy, cold, and endless. The wind was howling across the Kansas plains, carrying with it a strange hum, almost like voices buried under the wind. She hurried toward her car, her boots crunching against the frost-bitten ground. Every step felt heavier than the last, as if the air itself were trying to pull her back. Inside the car, she sat trembling, staring at the camera on the passenger seat. She lifted it slowly, her reflection faintly visible in the lens. But as the lightning flashed outside, she saw something else behind her, just for a moment. A tall silhouette standing by the barn's open doors. She blinked, and it was gone. Her heart pounded. She jammed the key into the ignition and drove off down the narrow dirt road, headlights cutting through the fog like thin, shaking blades. The old farmhouse disappeared behind her, swallowed by the storm. She thought she had escaped. But when she looked in her rearview mirror, she swore she saw the faint image of the barn again, closer than before. By the time Eleanor reached her small motel on the edge of town, the storm had broken. She pulled into the gravel lot, panting, hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that her knuckles had gone white. She sat there for a long moment, unable to move, her eyes drawn again to the old camera. Its lens, cracked and fogged, seemed to breathe with faint condensation. She finally picked it up and placed it on the table inside her room. The air inside was still, but somehow colder than the rain outside. She couldn't resist. She developed the film. One photograph, just one. The chemical smell of the developer filled the room as the image slowly appeared on the paper under the dim red light. But what took shape made her stomach twist. It wasn't the barn. It wasn't the ledger. It was herself, sitting in the driver's seat, staring into the rearview mirror. But behind her, in the back seat, was the faint outline of the boy, his head tilted, his hollow eyes locked directly on hers. Her breath hitched. The photograph slipped from her hands and fluttered to the floor. She backed away slowly, unable to look at it again. But the truth had already settled into her bones. She hadn't escaped the barn. The curse had simply followed her. The figure she thought was bound to that old photograph was now bound to her. Eleanor turned toward the mirror hanging above the motel sink. The reflection stared back, but just over her shoulder, half in shadow, was a face that didn't belong to her. Eleanor didn't sleep that night. The image of the boy in her back seat burned behind her eyes every time she blinked. She tore the photo to pieces and flushed it down the motel sink, watching the paper curl and dissolve in the water. But even then, she swore she could still see faint eyes staring up from the drain. Her hands shook as she turned away, but she caught a glimpse of her reflection again, and this time, the boy wasn't behind her. He was beside her, close enough that she could almost feel his breath on her neck. The following morning, sunlight bled weakly through the blinds, but it did nothing to ease the chill. Eleanor packed her things and left the motel without looking back. The town was quiet, almost too quiet. As she drove, she noticed something strange on the dashboard. Her old photograph from the archives, the one of the Miller family, sitting perfectly folded, though she'd left it locked in her bag. Her hands went cold. She unfolded it. The figures in the photo had changed. The family was still there, mother, father, and the boy, but the boy's head was now slightly turned. His gaze wasn't on the camera anymore. It was on her. And faintly, behind the family, there was now the shadow of a woman, her face blurred, but her posture unmistakable, camera in hand, standing just outside the barn door. Eleanor's heart stopped. That wasn't part of the original image. It was her. The photo had captured her standing where she had never been. The lens had turned on her. And somewhere between the past and the present, something had crossed over. She slammed the brakes and sat frozen in the middle of the dirt road, heart racing. The fields on either side were empty, but she couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching from the tall grass. The photograph lay on the passenger seat, trembling slightly with the vibrations of the idling car, the boy's eyes seeming to glint each time the sunlight flickered. Eleanor grabbed her phone and snapped a picture of the photo itself, desperate to prove to herself that she wasn't losing her mind. But when she looked at the phone screen, she went numb. The image showed the family and her, but now the boy was gone. Only the mother and father remained, their faces warped in expressions of silent, open-mouthed horror. Behind them stood the tall figure, a void of shadow shaped like a man, one long arm draped across both parents as though claiming them. Her pulse thudded in her ears. She tossed the photo out the window and sped off down the road. But the further she drove, the more the landscape seemed to loop. The same mailbox, the same tree, the same slanted fence. Every few miles, it was as if the world reset around her, like she was trapped inside the very photograph she had been studying. And then, through the static hum of her radio, a faint voice whispered her name. Once, then again, louder. She yanked the dial off the console, but the voice continued, coming now from the back seat. Eleanor froze. She didn't dare look into the rearview mirror. The voice, small, fragile, but echoing with something ancient, whispered her name again. Eleanor, it wasn't angry. It wasn't threatening. It sounded lonely. Against every instinct screaming at her to drive faster, she turned the mirror just slightly. For a fraction of a second, she saw him, the boy from the photograph, sitting perfectly upright in the middle of the back seat. His skin was pale as frost, his clothes the same worn suspenders from 1889. He tilted his head, and his eyes glowed faintly, reflecting the same dull gold tint that the old photographs carried when exposed to lamplight. Eleanor's throat tightened. "What do you want?" she whispered, her voice trembling. The boy didn't answer. He only lifted his hand and pointed forward, toward the horizon. When she turned, she saw it. The barn. The same one from the Miller photo. Somehow, impossibly, it stood before her again, exactly as it looked in the picture. The wood was warped, half-collapsed, but the faded paint still clung to the boards. It was as if the world had folded back in time. Her car sputtered to a stop on its own, as though the engine no longer mattered here. When she stepped out, the air felt heavy, thick with the scent of wet earth and something metallic beneath it. Old blood, perhaps, buried too long to name. The boy's voice came again, faint, drifting like fog. "He's still inside." Eleanor's pulse pounded. She turned back, but the car was gone. Only the dirt road remained, endless and silent beneath a pale gray sky. The barn door creaked as she pushed it open, the sound sharp and wet, like something living. Inside, the light was thin and dust-choked, filtering through holes in the roof. Old farming tools hung rusted along the walls, scythes, chains, nails, each one casting long, twisted shadows. And at the center of the barn, just beneath the sagging beams, was a single chair. On it lay a folded piece of yellowed paper. Eleanor approached, her breath catching as she unfolded it. The writing was shaky, scrawled in pencil that had nearly faded away. "He made me stand still," it read. "Said the camera would make me live forever. I didn't want to. I didn't want to." The rest dissolved into scratches. Beneath the paper, half buried in the dirt, she found a small metal tag, engraved with the name Samuel Miller. The name hit her like a blow. The missing child. The forgotten son. The one who was never listed in the census, never mentioned in the town's archives. She looked up, and the air changed. The dust began to swirl on its own, forming faint outlines. A woman sobbing, a man holding a camera, the boy standing stiffly before them. And then, in a flash like an exposed photograph, they were gone. Her heart hammered as she backed away. But the boy's voice came once more, Closer now, almost pleading. He took us all, Eleanor. He said the photo would keep us safe. But he lied. Eleanor felt her chest tighten as the last whisper faded into the echoing dark. He lied. The words reverberated through the hollow of the barn until it sounded like the beams themselves were murmuring them back. Her flashlight flickered weakly, and when she steadied it against her shaking hand, the beam landed on something she hadn't noticed before, a row of photographs nailed to the inner wall. Dozens of them, arranged neatly in a crooked line, their sepia edges curling with age. Each picture was nearly identical, the same barn, the same family, but in every one, someone new appeared. Sometimes it was a blurred figure in the background. Other times, a child's face pressed up against the window, and in the very last photograph, the one furthest to the right, she saw a reflection in the glass that made her knees go weak. It was the photographer. He wasn't smiling. He stood off to the side of the group, his old-fashioned camera propped on a wooden tripod, his face long and lean, eyes deep-set and lifeless. There was something horribly wrong about the image, like his body didn't quite fit the light around it. It was darker, as if the man had been pasted into reality. Below the photograph, faint and carved into the wood with what looked like a nail, were the words, "Thaddeus Crowe, Keeper of Light, 1889. Eleanor whispered the name out loud, and as she did, the air grew cold. A whisper of static filled her ears, faint at first, then sharp like a radio tuning to a dead channel. She felt the walls tilt around her, the barn seeming to breathe. Inhale, exhale. Somewhere in the dark, a camera shutter clicked. The sound of that shutter, dry and final, froze her in place. She turned in a slow panic, shining her light toward the back of the barn. There, half hidden behind a stack of decayed crates, was an old wooden camera. It was impossible that it still worked. The lens was cracked, the bellows torn, and yet, as Eleanor approached, she saw the faintest shimmer of movement within the lens, like something trapped behind the glass was alive. There were initials carved into the camera's base, TC. She crouched, brushing off layers of dust and grime until she found another inscription, barely visible. To capture the soul, you must still the heart. Her hand recoiled. The barn felt alive now, the walls whispering, the rafters groaning. Eleanor's flashlight dimmed, and in that brief shadow, she thought she saw figures moving in the corners. Children standing motionless, their faces blurred, women holding bouquets, men with hollow eyes. Each face matched the ones from the photographs. Then, the camera clicked again, though no one was touching it. A blinding flash of pale light filled the space, and for an instant, Eleanor felt weightless. When her vision cleared, she was standing in front of the barn door, the morning light bleeding through. But the barn was no longer full of dust and decay. It was new again, polished wood gleaming, and voices laughing somewhere behind her. The year, she realized, wasn't 2025 anymore. The silence that met Eleanor was too perfect. The air smelled of hay and smoke, but without decay, warm, living, present. Her flashlight was gone, replaced by soft sunlight pouring through clean, narrow windows. A child's laughter floated from outside, followed by the sound of boots against wooden planks. She turned, heart pounding, and saw the same family she'd studied for weeks, the Galloways, standing together, smiling for their photograph. But this time, they were moving. The father straightened his vest. The mother adjusted her daughter's ribbon. The photographer, Thaddeus Crowe, stood behind the tripod, his gloved hands steadying the frame. Eleanor's breath caught. None of them noticed her. It was as though she didn't exist. The only one who did was a small boy sitting by the window, the one who, in the old photo, had been hidden in the shadows. His name, she remembered from the records, was Thomas. The child everyone had said had never existed. Thomas lifted his head and looked directly at her. His eyes were wrong, too aware, too knowing. And then, without a sound, he smiled. "You came back," he whispered, voice echoing faintly as though spoken from inside her skull. Eleanor stumbled backward, knocking into a chair that wasn't there seconds ago. The barn flickered around her, the light dimming. the scene unraveling like a film strip. The laughter twisted into shrieks. The smiles melted into frozen expressions. The photographer's head turned slowly toward her, though his body stayed still. The camera clicked. Once, twice, and on the third click, everything stopped. The barn had gone dark again, but not the same kind of darkness as before. This was layered, thick, suffocating, like she was buried beneath a photograph. The figures of the family were frozen mid-laugh, mid-breath. Their eyes were glassy, their skin gray. Eleanor felt for the door, but her hands met a wall that felt like paper, smooth, thin, slightly warm. When she pressed harder, she saw her palm distort the air around it, like pressing against a stretched photograph surface. Then, she saw him, the forgotten son. Thomas was standing by the camera now, holding it with both hands, his small fingers gripping the cracked wooden frame. His eyes glowed faintly, reflecting the light that came from nowhere. "It's your turn," he said, the voice no longer childlike. It was layered, one tone of a young boy, and another of something much older, buried beneath centuries of silence. Eleanor shook her head. "This isn't real." Thomas tilted his head, and his smile widened until it broke the shape of his face. "You look too long," he whispered. "Now the picture needs you." The camera's lens began to hum, the light within it spinning like an eye opening. Eleanor screamed and ran toward the barn door, but the world rippled, the boards melting into sepia blur. The sound of the shutter filled the space one last time, impossibly loud, echoing like thunder. When the light faded, the barn was empty again. Only the new photograph remained, drying on the ledge. And in it, standing among the Galloway family, was Eleanor. In 1993, long after the Galloway farm had been swallowed by weeds and memory, a young amateur photographer named Daniel Whitmore stumbled upon the derelict barn while exploring Kansas's rural backroads. He wasn't searching for anything in particular, just textures, shadows, forgotten places. He liked how decay framed beauty, how the past seemed to bleed through when light hit old with the right way. But when he stepped inside, his camera began to malfunction. The lens stuttered, the film jammed, and the air inside the barn felt inexplicably charged. In the corner, beneath layers of cobwebs, he found a framed photograph lying face down in the dust. It was cracked, the glass half shattered, the edges blackened by time. Carefully, Daniel lifted it and froze. The image showed a rural family, posed stiffly in front of a barn door. Their clothing was 19th century, their faces pale but smiling. But one detail made his stomach twist. Behind the family, between two adults, stood a woman who clearly didn't belong. Her clothes were modern, flannel shirt, jeans, camera strap around her neck. Her face, though faded, was shockingly lifelike. Her name tag read Eleanor. He thought it was a prank, an old photo someone had edited or staged. But the paper wasn't reprinted. It was authentic silver gelatin, dated and aged beyond forgery. Daniel slipped the photo into his bag, intending to research it later. But when he left the barn, the wind picked up, a low moaning sound rising from the fields like distant voices. He didn't notice the faint imprint that had appeared on the barn's window, a handprint, pressed from the inside. That night, Daniel returned to his small apartment in Wichita and laid the photo on his desk under a lamp. The longer he looked, the less still it seemed. The shadows behind the family deepened, as if breathing. He convinced himself it was just his eyes adjusting, or maybe dust on the glass. But when he developed the photos from his day's shoot, one frame caught his breath, a modern shot of the barn interior. In it, near the far wall, a faint reflection of Eleanor stared directly into the lens. He hadn't seen anyone there when he took it. He zoomed in, heart pounding, until the grain broke apart. The woman's face was distorted, eyes pale, mouth slightly open as though whispering. Below her, faintly visible, were the blurred outlines of small hands, a child's hands. That night, Daniel dreamed of the barn. The walls pulsed with light, the family standing motionless in the same positions. The camera sat in the center, its shutter twitching on its own. And in the reflection of its lens, he saw himself, standing behind them all. He woke up drenched in sweat, heart racing. The photo was gone from his desk. In its place was a fresh print, edges damp and still smelling of developer fluid. He picked it up, trembling. It showed the same family, the same barn. But now, standing to their right, holding a camera at his side, was Daniel. For 3 days after that night, Daniel vanished. His phone was found in his car, parked along a rural Kansas road not far from the Galloway farm. Locals told police he had been seen wandering near the property just before sunset, holding his camera and muttering to himself. When authorities searched the barn, they found his camera shattered on the floor, as though dropped mid-stride. The only photo still inside was the same old family portrait, but now every face was gone. Only silhouettes remained, and in the center of the frame, clear as day, stood Daniel, mouth open in horror, his body half faded like smoke. No one could explain it. The negatives he had developed the night before were also missing from his apartment. His prints, however, were found pinned to the walls, hundreds of them. Each photo showed the barn from different angles, and in every single one, that same pale figure of the child stood closer and closer to the camera, until in the last photo, it was just a close-up of one blurred, glassy eye staring back. The newspapers at the time ran only a small story, local photographer missing after visit to abandoned farm. The police concluded he must have fallen into one of the dry wells nearby. But the townsfolk knew better. They remembered the rumors about the Galloway child, about eyes that followed people from photographs, about the curse that started in 1889 and never truly ended. Weeks later, Daniel's landlord began renting out his apartment again. The new tenant, a young art student, began cleaning the walls and found one last photo tucked behind a mirror. It was a picture of the barn, same as the others, except this one looked newer. The weeds outside had been trimmed. The sky was overcast, the boards freshly nailed, as if time had repaired it. In the bottom right corner, faintly written in pencil, were 3 words, "Don't photograph her." When the student took the photo to be examined by a local historian, the expert confirmed something impossible. The paper was modern, but the ink used for the handwriting hadn't existed since the 1890s. Even stranger, when scanned, the image contained subtle movement, the faintest fluttering of something in the shadows, like the blink of an eye. And then, not long after, people began reporting odd things online. A few who downloaded the scanned image claimed their phones glitched, their cameras froze, or they saw a reflection, a child, standing behind them in their photos. The barn, long demolished, exists now only in pictures. But every few years, the image resurfaces, in a new format, a new device, a new century. It's said that if you stare long enough into the sixth figure's eyes, you'll see them move. Not a trick of the light, not imagination, just a forgotten child of 1889, still waiting for someone new to capture their soul again.